Living on a 50-acre farm had its perks: fresh air, peace and quiet, and absolute freedom from the petty drama that seemed to plague suburban neighborhoods. At least, that's what James Carter thought when he inherited his family's farm just outside of Oakwood County. He had grown up on this land, learned the ins and outs of farming from his father, and after years of working in real estate, he had returned home to manage the land full-time. The closest neighbor was about half a mile away, and that suited James just fine. That is, until Karen Winters moved in. Karen had bought the 2-acre property that bordered James's farm, a move that wouldn't have concerned him at all, except for the fact that she was the most entitled woman he had ever met. Within weeks of moving in, she started complaining about everything: the occasional scent of manure from the cattle, the sound of his tractor, and even the fact that his barn was ruining her view. She had knocked on his door more than once to suggest he modernize the farm, as if he cared about her city slicker opinions. But James had ignored her. His farm had been here for generations. If she didn't like it, she shouldn't have moved next to a farm. Then, one summer morning, James drove out to check his south pasture, where he usually kept some of his cattle, only to find something that made his jaw drop: a massive in-ground swimming pool, complete with deck chairs and a poolside bar, had been built on his land. James froze, trying to process what he was looking at. The pool wasn't just on the property line. It was a good 20 feet into his land. He saw tire tracks from construction vehicles, trampled grass, and even a pile of discarded dirt nearby. But the worst part, Karen and her friends were lounging by the pool, sipping margaritas like they owned the place. James took a slow, deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm as he parked his truck and marched toward them. "Hey!" he barked, his voice sharp and demanding. The laughter and chatting died down as Karen, wearing oversized sunglasses and an obnoxiously large sun hat, turned to face him. "Oh, hi, James," she said breezily, as if she hadn't just trespassed on his land and built an entire pool without permission. James crossed his arms, his patience already razor-thin. "Want to explain why there's a damn pool on my property?" Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, relax. You weren't even using this land. I had some extra space in my yard, and I thought, why not expand? It's just a little over the property line." James gritted his teeth. "A little? You built 20 feet into my land. Did you seriously think I wouldn't notice?" Karen sighed dramatically, as if he was being the unreasonable one. "James, come on. It's just a pool. It's not like it's hurting anything. In fact, I think it makes your farm look nicer." James could barely believe what he was hearing. "This isn't about looks, Karen. You had no right to build anything on my property. Did you even get a permit?" Karen hesitated, then turned back to her drink. "Permits are for people who worry too much about rules," she said airily. James had had enough. Without another word, he spun on his heel and walked back to his truck. He wasn't about to argue with someone who clearly had no regard for boundaries or the law. If Karen thought she could build on his land without consequences, she was about to get a very rude awakening. James Carter had dealt with a lot of absurd situations in his years as a farmer, but never had anyone been as blatantly entitled as Karen Winters. She had built a massive pool, not just near the property line, but 20 feet onto his land, without asking, without permits, and without any regard for the fact that it wasn't hers. And then, to make things worse, she had the audacity to act like it wasn't a big deal. James knew one thing for sure. Karen was about to regret every single decision that led her to this moment. Step 1. The legal bombshell. James wasted no time. As soon as he left the poolside spectacle, he drove straight into town to visit his family lawyer, Henry Lawson. Henry had been handling Carter family legal matters for over 2 decades, and when James explained the situation, the older man leaned back in his chair, chuckling dryly. "She actually built an entire pool on your land?" Henry asked, shaking his head in disbelief. James nodded, his jaw still tight with frustration. Didn't even try to hide it, just sitting there with her friends, sipping drinks like she owns the place. Henry exhaled, flipping open a legal pad. All right, this is clear-cut trespassing, property damage, and an illegal structure violation. First thing we do is send her an official cease and desist notice. She's required to remove the pool immediately or face legal action. James smirked. Oh, I want legal action. I want to make sure she never tries something like this again. Henry nodded. We can also file for damages. You're entitled to compensation for any destruction of your land, especially since construction vehicles tore up your pasture. James leaned forward. And if she ignores the letter? Henry's smile turned sharp. Then we escalate. We take this to court and force her to pay every last cent it costs to tear that pool out. James felt a deep satisfaction settle in his chest. This was just the beginning. Step 2, draining the problem, literally. James wasn't a man who liked to wait for things to happen. So while his lawyer drafted the legal notice, he decided to send Karen a more immediate message. That evening, he grabbed his industrial-grade water pump, drove back out to the pasture, and got to work. If Karen thought she could build a pool on his land, then she was going to learn the hard way that he had full control over it. Within minutes, the pump was humming, and the crystal-clear water that Karen had so proudly flaunted began rushing out onto the dirt. James stood there, arms crossed, watching with satisfaction as thousands of gallons of water drained into the soil, turning the once pristine pool into a useless, empty crater. And then, like clockwork, Karen came storming out of her house. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, barefoot and furious, her ridiculous sun hat flopping as she stomped toward him. James barely looked at her. "I'm draining my land, Karen," he said evenly. "You built this pool illegally, and I didn't give you permission to keep water on my property." She threw her hands up. "You can't just drain it. That's my pool." James finally turned to face her, his expression unamused. "No, Karen, it's my land, and I don't want a pool on it." Karen's face turned red with rage. "I spent thousands on this. You're ruining everything." James shrugged. "Not my problem." And with that, he went back to work, ignoring her completely. Karen stormed away, and he figured that would be the end of it. But Karen being Karen, she did the one thing that could make the situation even more ridiculous. She called the cops. Step 3, the sheriff's arrival. James was still standing by the now empty pool, wiping sweat from his forehead, when a patrol car pulled onto his farm road. 2 uniformed county sheriffs stepped out, officers he actually knew well, given that he had lived in Oakwood County his whole life. Karen came running up behind them, her voice shrill and dramatic. "Officers, arrest him. He's trespassing and destroying my property." One of the deputies, Officer Ray Mitchell, gave James a look that said, "What the hell did you do now?" James smirked, shaking his head. "Not trespassing, Ray. This is my land." Karen's jaw clenched. "That's not true. That pool is on my property." James wordlessly pulled a folded document from his back pocket, a copy of the property survey he had grabbed before leaving the house. He handed it to the deputy. Mitchell studied it, then gave Karen a blank stare. "Ma'am, this clearly shows the pool is on Mr. Carter's land." Karen's face dropped. James folded his arms. "That means she's the trespasser, Ray. And that pool? That's an illegal structure she built without permits." The second deputy, Officer Glenn Parker, sighed. "Karen, did you get permission from Mr. Carter to build this?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, her confidence completely shattered. "Well, I didn't think he'd mind," she stammered. Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "You didn't think the landowner would mind if you built an entire pool on his property?" "It's just a little on his land," she protested. Parker exhaled heavily. "Ma'am, you built a pool that's 20 feet onto his property. That's not a little. That's trespassing." Karen looked panicked now, but James wasn't about to let her slip out of this mess. "Now, Ray, I've got security cameras on my property," James continued, gesturing to the barn. "So if you need footage of the construction vehicles, I've got plenty of proof that Karen's crew was tearing up my land without permission. Mitchell's jaw tightened. That won't be necessary. He turned back to Karen. Ma'am, you're looking at multiple violations here. Illegal construction, trespassing, and destruction of private property. Karen's face turned ghostly pale. I didn't mean to break any laws. James let out a mocking laugh. Oh, you didn't mean to? That's funny, Karen. Because you sure acted like you owned the place when I confronted you about it. Mitchell sighed. Karen, we're going to need you to come down to the station and answer some questions. Karen let out a horrified gasp, clutching her chest as if she were the victim. You're arresting me? Mitchell gave her an exasperated look. Not yet, but if you don't comply, we'll be forced to escalate this legally. Karen burst into tears, wailing about how unfair this was, but James had zero sympathy. He had given her every opportunity to fix this mess, and instead of admitting she was wrong, she had doubled down, and now she was paying the price. James smirked as he watched the officers escort Karen to the patrol car, her fake sobs filling the air. And this was only the beginning of her consequences. James Carter stood at the edge of the now-empty crater that Karen Winters had dared to call her pool, arms crossed, watching as the sheriff's deputies guided her, still wailing, into the patrol car. The irony was almost too rich. She called the cops on him, and now she was the one getting hauled off for questioning. Justice had begun, but James wasn't done yet. Karen had spent thousands building this unauthorized pool, but what she didn't realize was that this was only the beginning of her nightmare. James had played nice, but now he was going to bury her in legal, financial, and social ruin, not out of pettiness, but because people like her needed to learn that actions had consequences. And he was going to make damn sure she felt every last one of them. Step 1. The lawsuit that would break her. The morning after her humiliating encounter with law enforcement, Karen did what all entitled people do when they don't get their way. She tried to play the victim. She marched over to James's property, still red-faced with rage and embarrassment, and attempted to demand that he fix everything. You had no right to destroy my pool, she screeched, standing just outside his barn. You're going to pay for this. James slowly turned from his work, wiping the sweat off his brow, and let out a low, amused chuckle. I'm sorry, Karen, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Did you forget that you built it on my land? Her face twisted in fury. That doesn't mean you can just wreck everything. James smirked. Actually, it means exactly that. Then, just as Karen was about to launch into another entitled tantrum, James handed her an envelope. She frowned, ripping it open, and as soon as she saw the letterhead, her expression twisted in panic. Congratulations, Karen, James said with a wicked grin. You're getting sued, Karen gasped, her hands shaking as she skimmed through the legal notice. The lawsuit covered everything: trespassing and illegal construction, destruction of private farmland, environmental damage from improper drainage, legal fees for property disputes. And the best part, James wasn't just suing for the cost of removal. He was suing for damages, adding up to over $150,000. Karen staggered backward, her confidence crumbling. Why, you can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious, James said, leaning against the fence. See, when you decided to bulldoze your way onto my land, you thought I was just some dumb farmer who'd let it slide. He shook his head. But you forgot one thing, Karen. Karen swallowed hard. What? James smiled. I play to win. Step 2, making sure she pays, literally. Karen did what anyone in her situation would do. She tried to fight back. She hired a lawyer, or at least tried to. Turns out, no one wanted to take on a case that was so obviously unwinnable. She even tried to countersue James, claiming he had intentionally sabotaged her pool. That backfired spectacularly when James's lawyer, Henry Lawson, ripped her apart in court. The security footage from James's barn showed Karen's construction workers trespassing and damaging the land. County permits proved she had zero authorization to build anything. The water damage report from draining the pool into the soil? That was enough for the Environmental Board to fine her separately. The judge didn't even need an hour to rule in James's favor. Karen was ordered to pay every cent of the $150,000 lawsuit, plus legal fees. And when she tried to weasel out of it, claiming she didn't have the money, James did what any smart businessman would do. He filed for a lien against her house, which meant that until she paid him in full, she couldn't sell or refinance her property without him getting a cut of the money. In other words, she was stuck. Step 3. Ruining her reputation. James could have stopped there, but after everything she had put him through, he wanted to make sure she never tried something like this again. So he took his fight to the public. The local news station, which had already covered the incident when Karen called the cops on herself, did a follow-up report detailing the entire lawsuit, her loss in court, and how she was now financially ruined. Even better, James shared the story on social media, where it went viral. People from all over weighed in. She thought she could steal from a farmer and get away with it. Karma hit her hard. I love when entitled people get exactly what they deserve. She called the cops on herself and still lost. That's next-level stupidity. Within weeks, Karen had gone from being the annoying neighbor to being the most hated woman in town. She couldn't show her face at the grocery store without someone recognizing her. Parents pulled their kids away from her at the community park. Her so-called friends, who had once enjoyed lounging in her stolen pool, abandoned her completely. And the final blow? The homeowners association that governed her little 2-acre property voted to remove her as a member. In other words, even her own HOA didn't want her anymore. The inevitable conclusion: Karen tried to hold on, but she was bleeding money. Between the lawsuit, legal fees, fines, and public humiliation, she had no choice but to sell her house and leave town. James made sure to attend the auction when her property went up for sale. He even put in a bid, just for the fun of it. Karen spotted him across the room, her face a mix of pure hatred and utter defeat. James simply tipped his hat, smirking as she stormed out for the last time. A few weeks later, a nice family moved into Karen's old house. People who actually respected property lines and knew how to be decent neighbors. As for James, he returned to his peaceful life on the farm, enjoying the beautiful stretch of land that was rightfully his, free from entitled nonsense. Karen had thought she could steal from him and call the cops on him. Instead, she lost everything. And James, he got exactly what he wanted: justice, peace, and a damn good story to tell over a cold beer.